This recording is a dramatized, alleged confession based on what the narrator claims to have recorded. It is presented as a narrative. Any investigative framing should be accompanied by rigorous fact-checking and documented sources in supporting materials and credits. I was a man who learned very early that hunger could be negotiated. I learned that bargains are made not only in markets, but in moments when a hand trembles and a throat swallows shame for the promise of bread. I sit now with a tremor in my left hand and a ring that will not come off without leaving a bruise. I am 85. I was the Pope. I kept a ledger in my head for 40 years, and tonight I will read from it, because there are things a man removes from his chest only when he knows there is no court left to judge him. If you are listening because you want the full recording and a timeline stitched to documents, subscribe, because this recording is long and the ledger I mentioned contains names, dates, vault numbers, sums. There is more to show than words. They asked me once why I made the choice. It is a simple question that peels back to a single memory. The smell of stale bread in my grandmother's thin kitchen. The way my hands shook when I felt the weight of an apple in my pocket and knew I could not bring it home. I told myself then that hunger was a good teacher. It taught me how to negotiate. Hunger taught me to count favors in future tense. The inciting moment of everything that followed was not cinematic. There was no sudden thunderclap, no book that fell open to a page that smelled of sulfur. It was a crumpled note folded at the corner of a prayer book, slipped between a page about mercy and a sermon about humility. The handwriting was precise, European, with a flourish I later came to recognize as institutional. An invitation that did not invite, but commanded, midnight. The location, beneath the basilica, where no light of day had ever reached. In my account, I tell it as if the world had been reduced to that single corridor of stone. You feel the cold first, stone that drinks heat, and then the damp. Candles, in my memory, burned blue. There was a smell that I later learned to call sulfur, though at first I had no word for it. The men who met me that night were 7, cardinals I had seen in processions, men whose faces I had known for years, men who should have been more pious than they were. They wore their red like armor. They led me down into a chamber I had been told only existed in the oldest maps. At the center of the chamber, on a table with a cloth like the belly of a storm cloud, sat a man flawless in a way that made you uneasy. He was neither old nor young. He was dressed like a businessman, but his shoes made no sound on the stones. He introduced himself with a name that felt like a promise and a danger. He called himself Lucifer. That word, my word now, though in these pages and transcripts and in the cellar of my memory it feels theatrical, was offered to me as a title, not an accusation. He did not shout. He smiled as one might smile when presenting the terms of a will. What followed in the chamber was not a myth. It was a contract. I say contract because that is the frame I give it with my legalistic mind. Clauses, signatures, demonstrations of proof. He explained terms with the precision of a banker and the cadence of a temptation. Power, he said, wealth beyond comprehension, protection that would make enemies find their tongues when once they had been loud. In exchange, secrecy, obedience, and a small number of tasks each year, 3 tasks to begin with. No one outside that chamber, he promised, would ever understand. The church would rise as if by the hand of God, and yet those hands would be working by other ledgers. I signed. I know how that word sits on some ears, how it tastes like betrayal. I will not ask for forgiveness. I will not seek to rename cowardice as courage. I signed because of a child's memory and a man's vanity braided into ambition. I signed because I thought in that collision of needs that I could control the consequences. They asked for blood. The request was ritualized, bureaucratic, clinical. A pen, a small steel point. I remember the sting, sharp, immediate, almost apologetic. My blood on a parchment was turned into a seal. I watched it dry and thought of the apple I had once stolen. The ink ran into it like a tide, and the page took on a color that in later years I learned to despise. To prove the arrangement, he offered demonstration. He spoke of a window into the universe of money and vaults. 2 million euros, he said, in a Swiss account, under the number 777. The number, he smiled, was chosen. I did not ask why. Later I understood that numbers are the second language of orders such as his. Giovanni, the cardinal who had slid the note into my prayer book, gave me a P. It was stamped 777 and cold with foreignness. When I opened the first coffer with Paolo, an accountant who became a necessary instrument in everything that followed, the light that struck the metal stole something from the air. Gold, stacked like the ribs of a ship. It was proof that promises can be purchased and that confirmations can be made to glare at a man until he believes them. That proof made everything simpler and more dangerous. It turned the abstract into an arithmetic of temptation. 2 million. A demonstration of power disguised as a gift. The first task came 8 months later, almost like a homework assignment, and looked no more moral than sweeping dust under a rug. The task was named in a whisper. Take the 47 boxes labeled Archivio Donazioni 1978 to 1980 and reduce them to ash. The boxes contained ledger entries, letters, receipts, paperwork that could, in the hands of prosecutors or journalists, draw lines between who gave and who was given cover. Paolo told me the brazenness with the coldness of his training. Sister Lucia came back from the archive bewildered and pale. She opened one box and asked a question I will never forget. Why does it say offshore beside the name of that parish? I told her to leave it. I told her the archive was under quarantine for preservation. I learned that day the advantage of official language. It coagulates curiosity into submission. You learn to perform small cruelties as if they were clerical acts. I remember carrying the first box to the hearth of a deconsecrated room beneath a sacristy. The paper caught with a sound like a gasp. I watched the names curl into flame, watched dates become ash, like offerings that do not go upward, but vanish as if into some waiting throat. I told myself that I was destroying papers, not people. The distinction is tidy until the person you loved most in the world calls your name with a voice you do not recognize and asks why. The ledger that grew in my head from these acts had columns: date, task, beneficiary, consequence. With each task completed, more arrived. The tasks escalated in their moral scale and in their consequences. First, destroy evidentiary boxes. Second, contact a parish in a town where a priest had been accused and arrange a transfer, offering the accusing families quiet settlements and the priest internal therapy under supervision. Third, instruct foundations to reroute donations. Charitable funds that should have fed orphanages redirected into accounts for projects that never saw the light of day. Each seemed at first administrative: paperwork, meetings, signatures. Each had a human echo. You try to compartmentalize. You become practiced at not seeing faces. You tell yourself that the men you move from one parish to another will be safer if they are contained, that investigations can bruise reputations on both sides, that sometimes mercy is cruel. Paolo taught me to speak in precise language. A transfer with dignity, he would say, and the words suggested everything and nothing. He learned how to place money in corporate shells. He knew Swiss banks like a priest knows psalms. He grew into a necessary silence. The money built a private life that was not private. There were apartments that smelled of citrus and expensive linen under the guise of housing for visiting scholars. There were watches that I did not wear in public, but that sat like small suns in drawers. There were dinners with chefs who had never heard of humility, and paintings that spoke of lineage and conquest. I kept a modest face to the cameras. I practiced humility in front of cameras and the poor. I was lavish in a place no one in the press could enter, a suite under an altar where every convenience had a name that made me laugh at myself when I was alone. Two lives do not sit well in the same skin. The public part of me spoke of sacrifice. The private part measured in kilograms of gold and in encrypted ledgers. As my influence grew, so did the machine around it. Gifts to the institution were processed. Foundations multiplied. Offshore accounts multiplied like roots of a tree I had not planted. There are numbers I will say now as a test to my own conscience. Vault 777, Vault 888, Foundation Stella Maris, account names that read like saints with blank faces. In my recordings, I mentioned sums. They were counted in millions, then tens, then, depending on the year, hundreds. Paulo kept a ledger in his head and in his leather-bound book. 2 million, he would say, and the number acted as a door that opened to new favors. I tell these things not to shock for shock's sake, but because the pattern is instructive. Small administrative acts become policies. Policies become habits. Habits become a way of existing. We argued, sometimes, within the circle that met in subterranean rooms. Giovanni, who introduced me to the chamber, was soft by appearance and cutthroat by action. He loved the apparatus because it gave him a form of immortality and influence. He would say, in a whisper that smelled of pipe tobacco, "The church is a vessel. The contents must be steady." He meant by steadiness the capacity to keep the institution intact by whatever means necessary. I argued that certain lines could not be crossed. He smiled and placed an envelope on the table. The first time a life was extinguished because of what we kept, I told myself it was not my hand that closed. A man named Father Antonio, below him in the hierarchy, someone with a tenderness for children and an inability to keep secrets, began to ask questions about transfers. He asked in the corridors with the soft persistence of a priest who cannot sit with a conscience that is unsettled. We reassigned him. He entered a hospital for a routine check and never left. The official line was heart failure. The family accepted it with a mixture of grief and gratitude for an explanation. In my account, I say, the recording suggests this was a coincidence. In my memory, I remember his eyes the week before he died, and the way his hand placed itself on my sleeve as if to anchor himself in a friendship that was not transactional. This is the point where the clauses of the contract began to breed consequences that no ledger could rationalize. My nights changed. Sleep opened like a wound. I would wake and see the shadow of my body moving where my body did not move. The motif of the shadow, how it sometimes performed the action my flesh did not, recurred for years. A hand gesturing that I had not made. A mouth mouthing words I had not spoken. I learned to distrust my reflection. Pride became a new hunger. A woman named Sister Maria once found me in a small chapel with a box of letters I had set aside. I had intended to burn them. Letters from families that cast light on how donations were made, testimonies of those who expected aid. She looked at the letters and then looked at me. She had the kind of faith that is less about doctrine and more about the daily acts of caring. She said simply, "They will come to you in the night if you keep their prayers in a drawer." She was half in jest, half an admonition. I smiled something like a priest and then gave the order. The archive would be closed to maintain sanctity. Within a month, Sister Maria fell ill. It was called stress, and the parish assigned her to a retreat. She never returned to the archive. The pattern grew predictable and monstrous. Witnesses fell ill, resigned, or relocated. Some were interned in facilities with diagnoses that could be written on a single line of a medical form and then be buried in a file. Others were found dead with explanations that included aneurysm, heart attack, suicide. The recording I made years later catalogs names. It lists Sister Teresa as finding a ledger and being found, later, at sea with the boat capsized and no explanation that made sense to her family. In the voice of the narration, I mark this as in his account, or alleged. I do this to protect the listener from meanness and to protect the story from the certainty it does not deserve. These were not always vast conspiracies with swivel chairs and dramatic betrayals. Many tasks were small and administrative and coldly effective. A letter misfiled, a canonical process delayed, a document labeled confidential and then disappeared. Each administrative whisper was a blade when aimed at a life. The slow, bureaucratic strangulation is less sensational in cinema, but more devastating in truth. People lost jobs, reputations, the ability to care for their families when the church that promised care instead offered silence. There are moments that occur in this ledger that I remember with the clarity of a bell. The day a journalist named Marco, hearing of whispers, arrived at the chancery with a recorder, sweating and hopeful, is one of them. He was young and hungry. He asked questions about financial circuits, about foundations, about transfers. We gave him a polite interview and the press secretary misplaced an appointment. He later had a car accident on a road that in his account he had used daily for years without mishap. The official report called it a failure of the steering. Friends told me privately, "Be careful." In the recording I keep, I describe this as an allegation of fortune and a coincidence of timing. I do not have quartz to offer up, and neither does this recording. But I carry the memory of Marco's smile as he left the chancery thinking he had found a story. I tell you these things because the arc of my life turns on the arithmetic of choices compounded by silence. When you are presented with power for which you have not prepared your heart, it will teach you new languages. I learned the language of plausible deniability. It was a pastoral decision. It was an administrative transfer for therapeutic reasons. We cannot comment while an internal review is ongoing. These phrases were literal shields. They turned questions into ciphers. They made the public image of humility credible, because humility had a face to show. Public prayer, pastoral visits, liturgical words. The private ledger filled, while the public ledger showed only devotion. By the mid-1990s, the mechanisms had become institutional, embedded in foundations and shell corporations with saintly names that ensured anonymity. I watched whole campaigns built on our wealth, charitable programs that never left the paper, hospital wings that were named and never paid for, scholarships that existed only on lists in vaults labeled 888. People visited those centers, and we told them their generosity was used well. They did not know that a portion of funds was siphoned to accounts that paid for legal teams, for settlements, for the purchase of silence. I have to describe with bluntness one ritual that marks the descent from covert misdeeds to something that feels like sacrilege. In the year 1999, as the ledger swelled, I was summoned to perform something the men in the chamber called a confirmation. It was not a sacrament in any ecclesial sense. It was a ceremony that read like a corporate renewal of terms. They called it mercy. I will not. It began with a performance in a deconsecrated chapel, blue candles, hallowed hymnals open to pages we would not chant. Paolo brought envelopes with names and sums. We were told to observe silence and to sign our names, not with blood this time, but with consent in the form of deliberate non-action. We were told that those who found out would be managed. A list was presented, names of journalists, activists, priests, cardinals who posed the danger to what we had built. I felt then in old fear that the apparatus had exceeded my ability to command it. I had become a steward of a system that swallowed even the stewards. It is here, in these recountings, that I cannot avoid the moral truth I wore like a second cassock. Every time I consented to concealment and transfer, I traded a piece of my soul for a transactional comfort. The comfort had edges and costs. I would look at children in the square and feel a rusted weight settle somewhere near my heart. I would look at the poor and recite blessings and feel hollow. The cognitive dissonance was a drumbeat. People imagine corruption as a series of explosions, a scandal exposed, men dragged into public humiliation. Real corruption is quieter. It is an accumulation of tiny betrayals, each of which seems rational in documentation. The ledger hides itself in legality. We learned to create paperwork that could mislead auditors, to label transfers as reserve funds, to invent projects that produced invoices but no work. Paolo taught me where to place money so that it appeared charitable on balance sheets but functioned as slush funds in the margins. He would joke about the bureaucracy, how it was easier to hide a bank than a conscience. We both laughed, and the laughter always sounded like a confession. There were nights when I tried to stop. I attempted more than once to create a firewall. I proposed transparency to a circle in which trust had been replaced by calculations. I stepped away from a decision and found my seat filled by a man I had once thought lesser. The entity, my word for it, though entity is theatrical, made its displeasure known in ways that were not always direct. A donation promised for a parish did not arrive. A scandal in a diocese popped up at the precise moment when a vote needed to be turned. The machinery had become reactive, as if it had agency beyond our comprehension. And then there were the visions. I do not mean to be dramatic. A man in a cassock, living a life of symbolic poverty while secretly drinking from gilded cups, will find that symbols begin to mock him. Mine came as images, a procession of faces behind a curtain, each face the shape of those we had silenced. A choir that sang the names of men whose graves were unmarked. I would wake with my mouth tasting of metal and think that perhaps the bargain had a clause I had missed, that the soul would be a ledger entry to be reconciled in an account beyond human arithmetic. I write this in a voice that vacillates between cynicism and regret because that is what I feel. Sometimes I am proud of what I achieved, the consolidation of an institution that was under threat, the avoidance of schisms that might have broken communities. At other times, in the quiet between prayers, I hear Sister Lucia's question and know the answer. To preserve an institution at the cost of justice is to hollow it. There were also brief, almost comic moments of rationalization. When I first tasted the private life that wealth afforded, I told myself I had a right to rest. I crafted an inner monologue that was as bureaucratic as any memo. If I maintain this, I can keep the church whole. If the institution remains intact, more souls can be saved. It is a familiar logic, and it is seductive because it dresses selfishness in the robes of charity. By 2003, the machinery had produced a candidate machine behind my candidacy, and my name began to circulate in a way I had attempted to avoid. I was wary of the throne, but also flattered. Power is a narcotic, and I was by then aware that the human heart was built to crave it. In the conclave, there were votes and negotiations and the kind of backdoor arithmetic that in my account I confess as necessary. Giovanni, who loved the apparatus, leaned in and said, as if predicting a calendar, "You will preside, and you will preserve." I did not ask him how he knew. My election, if you accept this narration at face value, was less divine intervention than the culmination of quiet trades. The papal ring fit on my finger like a seal. The camera saw a man bowed in humility. The people saw simple gestures, homilies about poverty and the dignity of the poor, and a man who seemed to carry the church on his shoulders with piety and grace. Behind closed doors, the ledgers continued. Foundations kept their scheduled disbursements. Accounts named after saints accepted sums and apportioned parts to their designated uses. At this point in the ledger, the consequences escalated. The list of names grew longer. From the shadows emerged an echo, a rumor that the man I had met in the catacombs was not a metaphor but an actor in a larger theater. That rumor gathered, and those who breathed it were often swatted by the mechanisms of explanation. A story discredited, an accusation labeled a slander. The public never saw the small administrative knives that cut at lives. I pause here in my account, because this is the moment when paths diverge. The story that follows loses some of its initial innocence. There are rituals described that are not liturgical. There are requests that move into darker territories, and there are deaths that the official lines cannot arrange into a plausible sequence. I have laid out the chamber and the key and the first boxes. I have told you about the Vault 777 and the 2 million euros that smelt like promise. I have told you how the apparatus grew. What remains is the part of the ledger that is harder to share. The moments of rupture where utility and cruelty meet. The names of those who were silenced. The precise sense of conscience eroding until it becomes a background noise. There are 1,000 small scenes that will come after. A man found in a river with a closed wound. A priest turned into silence by a diagnosis that never fit. A journalist's recorder found broken by gravel. A note tucked under a Bible that read only one word, remember, in a handwriting that later became a threat. But before those episodes, a night that seared itself into me, a night where room and spirit crossed, and the physical became prophetic. It is enough for now to say that the confession I make is a map leading to a place I did not want to see, and the map has stains of my own hands. I sign it with an old ring that bites the skin, with a throat that remembers the taste of apples and the smell of sulfur, and with a voice that hopes someone will listen. If you stay with this recording, know two things. First, that the following is presented as the narrator's account, allegations, not proven facts. And second, that the material here, if used as an investigative piece, demands corroboration. Check vaults, read ledgers, talk to those named in dossiers. The rest of the ledger is long, and it grows darker. The night I speak of came after many smaller betrayals, and it burned into the ledger of my memory as if ink had been scorched into paper. It began, as many tragedies do, with a routine summons and ended as a thing that made ritual and law collide into the same ruin. I was told to be present in a chapel that had been taken out of the liturgical rotation. A room of stone and silence beneath an old wing where the heat never quite reached. The chamber smelled of wax and something else, a bitter tang that sat like a bruise behind the nose. Paolo carried envelopes as if they weighed nothing. Giovanni walked with the small smirk of a man who believes history is his to edit. They called it a confirmation. That was the euphemism offered. In my account, it was a renewal of consent dressed in sacramental vocabulary. We were asked to sign, not with blood this time, but with an affirmation so thorough that refusal would have required more than a letter. We inked names beneath lists that described persons labeled problematic and manageable. On the table lay the same paraphernalia that had haunted my dreams for years. A key stamped 777, a ledger with numbers that moved like tide marks, a thin, blood-stained parchment that had been folded and refolded. I remember how the candlelight ate at the gilt of the frame, and how the faces around the table took on the masks of men doing business. I remember the moment the ceremony became something else. It was subtle, a pause in the murmured Latin, an inflection not of a priest, but of the man I had first met beneath the basilica. In my account, he spoke like a lawyer and like a lover. He spoke of tenure and stewardship, of protections that would outlast our names, of an order that would sit like a shadow if order was necessary. He called our bargains stewardships. He said, almost conversationally, that an arrangement such as ours thrives when it is efficient. He spoke of 40 years as a number that pleased him. He said it with the generosity of a figure quoting a statute. In the ledger of my memory, his mouth shaped the number with a casual cruelty. 40 years. 40 years is a long time. It is almost an ecclesial lifetime. It is long enough for a chair to assume the shape of a man's body, long enough for habits to calcify into doctrine, long enough for denominational memory to forget the smell of original decisions. He said 40 years as if that were a promise to him, but in my account it sounded like a clock wound by someone else. I remember thinking then that the word 40 had the taste of a covenant and the arithmetic of ownership. I believed, for reasons that are my condemnation, that the arrangement would be contained in such tidy numerology. What followed that ceremony was a sequence that felt both preternatural and profoundly mundane. Tasks arrived like circulars, brief, bureaucratic, with the ritual silence of a red stamp. Some demanded paperwork and signatures. Others required human dispositions. The second decade of my ledger is full of such entries. There are nights I will never reconstruct perfectly, because memory softens as a wound forms callus. But there are files within my head that keep the dates like nails. There was the business of custodial transfers. Priests moved from one parish to another with the clinical language of pastoral care. The second decade of my ledger is full of such entries. There are nights I will never reconstruct perfectly, because memory softens as a wound forms callus. But there are files within my head that keep the dates like nails. There was the business of custodial transfers. Priests moved from one parish to another with the clinical language of pastoral care. The language is a shield, for a reason. We used phrases that had a sound of compassion to anyone who listened without knowledge. He will serve in prayerful reflection, a temporary reassignment to focus on health and guidance. It was language that coagulated eyes, that made questions fell asleep. I remember Father Marco, a man with a kind smile and a memory of names of children in the town. He asked blunt questions about where a donation for a playground had gone. He was moved for spiritual renewal and did not return. The family never complained. They accepted a letter marked with a seal. They accepted a story that made sense. There were shipments, formal, named, documented, that moved from account to account. Paolo taught me the names of banks as if they were saints, domiciles with ledgers that could be bent like soft wire. We moved money into entities that bore saintly names in their registries: Stella Maris, Casa di Petro, Fondazione San Luca. The architecture was devout in appearance and secular in function. In the year 2001, in an appendix of a ledger I later scrawled into the margin of a worn notebook, I wrote 3 account numbers and the word arms beside one of them. I did not then imagine the gravity of that scrawl. Later, it would read back to me like a prophecy. There were people who understood nothing of the architecture that fed on them. Parishioners came to me with shoes worn thin and stories of a roof that had collapsed in a torrential storm. I blessed them and promised aid. In some instances, too many as I now confess, the promised assistance became the subject of a ledger's footnote. An entry might read, "Donation allocated, cloaked transfer to reserve. The paperwork was a kind of sacrament. It made absence seem like presence. I became practiced at a kind of liturgical hypocrisy. Words of mercy were used to mask calculations of concealment. The machinery, by midlife, had a logic of its own. It found efficiencies. It learned the routes of journalists and the sleepy timetables of small diocesan accountants. There were men who discovered things. Some were careless, and the machine would apply a remedy, a reassignment, a label, a slip in the schedule. Others were persistent. Sister Teresa was persistent. She found a ledger in a storeroom that listed efforts to obfuscate transfers connected to a children's hospital fund. She copied pages, perhaps thinking the truth could be preserved in carbon. She was found adrift at sea later that autumn. The official file read as a boating accident. In my account, I say that someone might read the type differently. In my memory, I see her hands and the way she held on to the rail of a small vessel, and thought, for a moment, she might be free. Not all deaths were dramatic. Some were slow. Minds dulled under the weight of stress diagnoses prescribed by physicians who never asked hard questions. Others were strange. Exorcists called in to help a soul were found in rooms with physical marks inconsistent with their recorded health histories. I remember one winter when two men who had publicly prayed that I might be different in private life both fell ill within weeks of exposing lines of finances to a reporter's inquiry. They were diagnosed with pathologies that existed in the lexicon of the aging: heart failure, aneurysm. In my account, I do not claim to have proof of complicity. I catalog the associations I lived through. The ledger of conscience does not always align with the ledger of evidence that a court would accept. There is the difference between what a man knows in his marrow and what can be proven on paper. And there were those who attempted to resist the machinery from within. I sought, at times, to make repairs. I raised the issue of transparency in meetings where men laughed politely or offered nods with no movement behind their heads. I proposed internal audits to foolish effect. Giovanni would counter with the language of survival. "We preserve the flock," he would say. "If the vessel sinks, all lose a harbor to shelter." He meant that the public institution required certain tactics to hold a fragile ecumenical balance. His arithmetic was simple: ends justify containment. Where I argued, he supplied an envelope. Where I wavered, there was swift practical adjustment. I tried once to call on a priest I had known in my early years, a man who had written pamphlets about the dignity of the poor, who had the naive courage of someone near the edge of his life and comfortable with simplicity. I told him aspects of what had been asked of me in private and asked what he would do. He took me to a window, looked outward at the city, and said quietly, "We are always tested by the shape of need before us." He did not advise. He simply took my hand and said the prayer for the dying. I left that room more fragmented than before. The most terrible escalations of our ledger were not always those with a dramatic headline. They were gradual, bureaucratic murders and quiet arrangements that ensured silence. But there was a night, a ceremony, if you will, that sits in my account as the pivot from administrative sin to something that looked like sacrilege. I have attempted to describe it to myself, and I will attempt to put it into words now, with the caveats I repeat because they matter. What follows is my recollection, my confession, my memory, an alleged account, not proof. It began with a requirement. The entity demanded a symbol of obedience. They spoke of a rite of sealing, a moment to bind obligation again, as if our earlier signatures could fray. We were led into a deconsecrated chapel, arranged with objects that mimicked liturgy, yet had been assembled intentionally to trouble the spirit. Candles of a blue so unnatural that their flames seemed to drink light. A chalice not of silver, but plate that had been scorched. Hosts that were no longer pale, but edge-lit with a dark film. The words were not Latin I knew from missal. They were a truncated grammar of corporate obligation and ritual theater. When I stood at that makeshift altar and lifted the chalice, the air around me tightened. The man I call Lucifer did not glare or shout. He narrated the transaction as one might read a balance sheet. 40 years, he said, as if checking a ledger. The arrangement will produce continuity. He spoke of protection like a clause in an insurance contract. Then he asked for a final consent to be sealed in a way I had not anticipated. He wanted me, then the vicar, to perform a gesture, one that looked like the sign of blessing, but that was inverted, a deliberate mirror. I did it. I remember the cold that followed, as if a physical frost had been pressed against the inside of my ribs. After that night, visions became more persistent, more insistent. The shadow motif I described earlier mutated. Sometimes the shadow walked into a room and closed a folder I had not touched. Other times it stood in front of a crucifix and turned its head where mine remained fixed forward. There were dreams, too, that occupied me in the small hours. A choir that sang the names of those we had quieted, and a ledger that unrolled like a river, carrying inked names away. The dreams left a metallic taste. They left a sense of being observed by a patience not human. In an effort to undo or to test our immunity, I reached out to men who might have the competence to handle what I believed was a spiritual entanglement. I sought exorcists, priests who had been trained in the rites, men whose names carry weight and who understand both demonic language and psychiatric lexicons. 2 were sent into rooms where files were kept. Both were found later with injuries inconsistent with their medical histories. One was reported to have fallen backwards down a flight of stairs. Another was said to have had a seizure. I do not know what happened. I only know that the pattern repeated itself, and the machinery of explanation ensured that questions did not gather momentum. When one tries to resist a system that has grown accustomed to obedience, the system adapts. That is how institutions preserve themselves, by either absorbing challenge or removing the challenger. There were threats, thinly veiled sometimes, legal pressure at other times, and there were methods of rerouting curiosity into the dead ends of bureaucracy. I learned to dread the simple ring of a telephone at odd hours because it often meant new news of a colleague who had been reassigned or an investigator whose access had been reduced. In my account, I do not claim authorship of every outcome. I confess the moral implication of association and the burden of choices. The ledger is not only a record of actions, it is a tattoo of the soul. It marks where the skin grew around the choices you make. By the time the new millennium turned into the second decade, I had a new awareness. The apparatus we had fed had ceased being responsive only to our hands. It had internalized procedures and relationships. It had learned to act with agility. It was in that period that the criminality of ordinary decisions became evident. A doctored report here, a suppressed inquiry there, a non-prosecution agreement that never saw daylight. The money, more than once, found ways to serve purposes I couldn't have imagined when, in 1981, I first knelt in a damp chamber with a hand trembling around a pen. There were journalists who came close. Marco, the reporter I mentioned earlier, was not the only one who sniffed at the margins. Others filed complaints, requested documents, asked ecclesial authorities for clarity. Some were stonewalled. Others were pacified with glimpses of documents that led nowhere. In one incident that still sits like a stone in my stomach, a dossier was provided to a newspaper with a false document attached. The paper printed a correction months later. The errant correction suffocated the original fever. The public moved on. The families kept their questions like sores. Not everyone who encountered our machine met an obvious end. Many escaped with bruises, careers damaged, reputations chewed into fragments. Some left the clerical state with public statements that read as if they had failed in their vocation. I remember one man, a bishop, Fernando, who had been kind to me when I was young, he had stumbled upon a transfer that did not reconcile. The explanation offered in his file was a natural death in his sleep. The family accepted the line with a depression that was more than grief. It was the kind that follows the discovery of a missing thing. In my account, I do not assert direct authorship of such ends. I only confess the weight of association and the memory of the faces of those who no longer could ask questions. My conscience did not fall away all at once. There are moments of small repudiation that I carry as if they were lifeboats. I tried, privately and ineffectively, to reroute funds legitimately at times. I proposed that certain reserves be audited and that more transparent mechanisms be put in place for donation oversight. The zeal with which those proposals were rejected taught me an unpleasant lesson. An apparatus constructed for opacity resists oxygen. My offers at reform were met with coded laughter, with the sliding in of envelopes, with casual suggestions that change would unsettle donors and provoke schism. The rhetoric of prudence became a club. As the years moved on, my interior life hollowed in ways I struggle to describe without sounding theatrical. Indignation and rationalization became indistinguishable. I found moments of real tenderness with people who had suffered because of our decisions. I sat with families, listened to their grief, and offered what I could in the idiom of pastoral care. Sometimes the comfort I offered seemed generous. Sometimes it felt obscene. The cognitive dissonance shrank me. It made me ask whether the vessel I had served, the church, was better preserved by the compromises I had accepted, or whether each preserved moment was a theft from the very people the church exists to serve. The thing about bargains is that they have want. They can demand renewal. At one summit, late in my pontificate, Giovanni and others presented an argument that felt procedural and inevitable. They said that to secure the institution against external forces, we must place more money into discrete projects, legal retainer funds, contingency reserves, security consultancies that operated in the margins between public and private life. The sums escalated. What had begun with $2 million in Vault 777 grew into longer columns. Vault 888, Vault 999, trusts in free ports, properties held under corporate names. Paulo's mastery of these mechanisms became more complete. He moved money with a surgical mind and an apparent lack of moral friction. He would say, with a kind of dry amusement, "Numbers do not judge us. They only do what they are asked." There is a peculiar cruelty in knowing that the world still produces small miracles, children born into poor neighborhoods where our charitable promises were supposed to reach, and that the apparatus you stewarded had, in many cases, been designed in ways that prevented those promises from materializing. I once visited an orphanage in a town that had been promised funds for repairs. The walls were damp. The toys were threadbare. I gave a speech that was eloquent in a way the press adored, spoke about sacrifice and the dignity of labor, and left as though I had fulfilled my duty. It is a memory that returns like a dented bell. The ledger of what I said publicly became a ledger that sought to divide itself from what I did privately. In 2009, I began to sense something that scared me more than any journalist or tribunal. A contractual completeness that felt like foreclosure. I believed then, with a clarity I no longer wanted, that the bargain expected compliance, not because it feared exposure, but because it had found a mechanism of generational persistence. The man I had met beneath the basilica had used the language of time, 40 years, and I now understood how durable a promise measured in decades can be. The machinery had matured into an institution that could outlive individual consciences. That realization made me small in a way that mortified me. It was at this time I began to consider a loophole. Canon law allows a pope to renounce. The clause is small and practical. It is meant to avoid schism and allow for the health of the office and the good of the universal church. It does not, of course, anticipate confessions such as mine. But within that provision, I saw a narrow window, a legal act that could stop me from performing new duties, new tasks, new signatures that the entity might command and that would compound into future sins. It was not a way to escape old wrongs. It was a way to refuse to add fresh ink to a ledger that would follow me beyond my days. I thought of it as a kind of contract breach, a single act of legal separation that might, perhaps, create a fissure in the machine's forward motion. It was a small, selfish hope, but it was hope. The decision to renounce did not feel like courage. It felt like a gamble between continuing to feed the apparatus or to stop feeding it and to let damages play out without my further consent. My friend, Cardinal Tarcisio, who had been a steady presence in the confessional of my private life, stood with me when I signed the renunciation. He saw my hands tremble as the ring circled my finger, and later as I took it off. He did not offer absolution for the ledger. He offered the simple dignity of presence. The entity in my account did not take kindly to the renunciation. I remember how the air in a room could thicken like steam when an arrangement you benefit from finds an obstacle. After the renunciation, the predicted consequences arrived with the lethality of bureaucracy, and the subtlety of grace turned sour. Funds that had once flowed for projects became harder to access. Promises to foundations were delayed. A press item here, a misfiled letter there. Eventually, the machine found ways to function without my signatures, but not without leaving a trail that moved like an animal sniffing a new scent. I had thought the act of renouncing would be a single stone dropped in a pond, and that ripples might disperse. Instead, it felt like a dam opening, and I could not predict whether what followed would be healing or flood. I was followed in ways that felt more cultural than physical. Invitations dwindled. My phone calls were not returned with the former immediacy. Men I had known for years avoided me in corridors. There were moments of reprieve, long afternoons where sunlight would find the books of my study and I would sit and write letters that would not be sent. I recorded the confession that now bears this voice not in a public forum but in a private room with a trusted cardinal. An act performed because I felt the need to make a ledger of the soul that was explicit and not subject to misinterpretation by those who might wish to whitewash or weaponize the past. In those last years, I also saw a strange continuity that chilled me. Successors, or those who rose after me, carried on patterns that looked too familiar. Whoever pulled the strings, if any one single man could be said to, had prepared the institution to survive the absence of any individual's consent. In a notebook I kept, I wrote the names of those I suspected would continue the work we had begun. I do not print them here as if they are verdicts. They are entries of worry on a man's paper. They asked me later why I did not speak sooner. Why did I not tell the world while I had the authority to dismantle what I had helped erect? The answer is humiliatingly simple: fear and calculation. Fear that the machine would retaliate in ways I could not unmake. Calculation that any exposure would shred lives and institutions in ways I did not want. There was a cowardice in me and a misguided utilitarianism in equal measure. I believed, wrongly, that preserving certain structures could be justified by the greater good of many. That premise is what I have spent each waking hour of my old age trying to interrogate. I died, eventually, years after the renunciation, having placed the recording in safe custody, telling the trusted cardinal that if anything happened to me, this tape should be shared. He swore it would not be released except under conditions he judged fit. I have learned that promises are fragile, even among friends. The tape, in his account and in others, leaked. It found its way into the ether. How it moved from an enclosed room to public hearing is a map I have not been permitted to fully trace. When it leaked, the reactions were as the world now expects: shock, outrage, denials, claims that any allegation was unfounded. I watch from the quiet of my final years, if watch is the right word, while men rewrite narratives and while families reopen questions they had quietly closed. The recording does what a confession does. It forces attention. It also does what confessions often do not intend. It opens wounds that may be raw without offering remedies. That is the bitter arithmetic of truth. There are people I harmed, bodies of work, names, reputations, lives. I think of Sister Lucia with her quiet hands who asked about the word offshore in a box and never returned to the archive. I think of Father Antonio and of Sister Teresa and of the journalist Marco. I think of their faces as if they were saints who ask us what we did with the bread we promised to give. If there is charity left in me, it is this, to place their names on my ledger and refuse to let them be mere collateral. There is also the question the title of any public presentation of this recording will ask. Did the entity, this figure I named in my first testimony as Lucifer, sit on the throne for 40 years? In my account, he said 40 years with a certain satisfaction. He saw continuity as an index of success. I served longer than that. I occupied the office for a span that, in my reckoning, exceeded his number in certain technicalities. But the point of the title is not merely arithmetic. The claim that an entity sat on the throne is what my confession alleges. That a set of hidden compacts, masked by sanctimony and enforced by a machine of silence, functioned with the efficiency of a corporation and the impunity of a cult. That is my allegation. It is presented as such. Whether a supernatural personage sat literally on any altar is not an assertion I can prove before a court. What I can say without hesitation is that in the space where governance and secrecy meet, decisions were made that cause human suffering, and that those decisions followed patterns described in this recording. The recording has consequences I cannot fully predict. It has already caused the reopening of some inquiries and the re-traumatizing of families who had sought closure. It has also been weaponized by those who wish to prove a thesis about evil and by those who refuse to believe in institutional failure. I advocate for neither triumphalism nor simple condemnation. I ask, as plainly as a man can who has been an instrument of harm, look into the ledgers. Open the vaults in the spirit of transparency. Invite independent reviewers. Let families see the documents that pertain to them. If this material is to be treated as an investigative thread, it must be accompanied by rigorous fact-checking and sources, names verified, papers authenticated, timelines corroborated. A dramatized confession, however revealing, cannot substitute for evidence in a court or for the painstaking work of truth commissions. If the recording spares that work, then perhaps some good shall come from the ruin I have contributed to. Some will read my voice and hear arrogance, because sometimes I say that the consolidation of the institution had its goods, that schisms were avoided, that perhaps some stability preserved ministries that would otherwise have splintered. That is not a defense. It is an admission of the logic that justified the choices. I am not proud of the ledger as ledger. I am ashamed of some of the entries. I confess to being proud at times when such pride was a moral sickness. There is, finally, the matter of justice, legal justice, ecclesial reckoning, and the moral judgment that I expect beyond the day of my death. I have tried, in these years, to set things right where I could. I donated some sums, transparently, in public, to causes that had previously been starved. I opened certain doors that had been closed and told the truth to at least one cardinal in private. None of these measures undo the ledger. They are, at best, attempts at penance that any religious man would know are inadequate. If there is a single truth I beg of any listener of this recording, it is this. Institutions that claim sanctity must be subject to the ordinary discipline of scrutiny. Reverence should not be a shield for opacity. I have been part of a machinery that replaced transparency with plausible administrative language, and that language became the smokescreen behind which real harm prospered. Let the tools of accountability, independent audits, forensic accounting, the willingness to hear victims without precondition be applied with vigor. In the end, do I regret the riches? Yes, if by riches one means the silence bought with envelopes and the prestige that tasted better than bread. Do I regret the choices that led to lives broken or orders that covered abuse? Yes, beyond measure. Yet I also recognize with unflinching honesty a darker part of myself that counted the cost and decided to trade for continuity. That calculation is mine and mine alone. I write this not to excuse it, but to name it. The tape that will carry this voice is a brittle thing. It will be argued over, dismissed by some, treasured by others. It will be used in books and in podcasts and perhaps in legal filings. If you are a listener who seeks to use the recording for investigative purposes, do so with the sobriety of historians. Verify, cross-reference, seek witnesses, let the family speak. If you are a believer who hears in my contradictions the failure of a man and not the faith I once served, then know this. My confession is a plea to separate the one from the many, the failing of a man from the endurance of the faith I inherited. The final irony I cannot refuse. When I signed that first parchment in 1981, tempted by bread and the image of a future I could bend to my will, I thought I might control the ledger. I did not. The ledger controlled me in ways that only become apparent when the arithmetic of decades is visible. I was tempted, I was complicit, and I am now forced to answer on a tape. They will ask, with the thick curiosity of the world, whether the entity still sits. My answer is both simple and terrifying in its ambiguity. The patterns I described continued beyond me, in forms I saw and in forms I did not. Men who run institutions are seldom singular. They operate in systems assembled by many hands. Whether the entity is a person, a party, a culture of secrecy, or something metaphysical is less the point than the observable fact that systems designed for opacity yield harm. That is the measurable truth. The sensational claim that an otherworldly occupant took a throne for 40 precise years and that the world was its stage is a framing of the narrative I offer. But the heart of the matter is human. Choices made in secret that consume lives. If you feel anger on hearing this, let the anger be a beginning. If you feel heartbreak, let it turn to action. If you are uncertain, let the uncertainty drive you to look at the papers, to press auditors, to demand transparency. The ledger I carried cannot be entirely transformed by one confession, but it can nudge the arc of accountability a fraction. A fraction matters. I end where I began. An old man, ring removed, with a voice the world might listen to or discard. I have said my piece with the usual failing of language. I have tried to be honest about what I did and what I allowed. Whether this recording changes the past is beyond my power. Whether it changes the future, by insisting on checks, by naming the wounded, by insisting that no institution be above scrutiny, that is the only hope I can offer. If this recording stirs you, if you want the next step on the trail, documentary follow-ups, the archival timeline, the lists of vaults and account numbers in a vetted dossier, look for the investigative pieces that will, I hope, be paired with this tape. Demand sources, demand corroboration, and if you think this matters, share it with someone who will care enough to follow the paper trail. I was a man who learned to negotiate hunger, and then learned that the bargains we make can feed more than our bellies. This is my confession, my ledger, and my plea. I am old, and I am not innocent. If anyone will take up the work of prying open the vaults and letting light into rooms that were built to be dark, let them do so with courage and with care for those who suffered. That is all I ask. If you reach the end of this recording, leave a note. Share what compels you to act, what troubles you, and what you would like investigated next. Consider watching the companion deep dive that will examine documents and interviews with those who can corroborate or challenge this account. For any documentary presentation that uses this material, prioritize independent fact-checking in the credits and provide access to primary documents for scholars and families. I sign this not with a plea for mercy. I have no right to beg it publicly, but with the hope that confession might be the beginning of repair. The ledger remains. May those who read it after me choose differently.